I'd like to go to Salem first day of session next year with everything having been prepared for enactment or enacted by the city council before we ask for tenant protections. And we know that increased tenant protections will be a major priority, or anticipate that they will be a major priority. So our focus and our singular attention to this matter, I think, is in large part due to the fact that you declared the emergency. State legislators heard you. They want to be helpful and have responded in kind. To respond in part to the question proposed by Commissioner Novick, the Housing Bureau prepares the state of housing, and we will release one this winter for 2016. We are specifically doing some deep dives into economic displacement, and one area of special concern of mine is the number of units that have been converted from month-to-month rentals to short-term rentals. There are some 2,700 whole homes offered on the short-term rental market in Portland. We think about 1,000 of those have been heretofore affordable month-to-month available rentals. You take 1,000 units out of the housing ecosystem in Portland, that's a value of about $380 million. It would cost that much to replace 1,000 units. So what you're seeing through homelessness on the streets is some of these ripples, if you will, in the market rate housing, which cram people into the affordable market. They're competing for fewer and fewer available units. And of course, the people with the least means to compete in that marketplace are often the most vulnerable, disabled, the people least able to cope with economic forces that we're faced with.
You say $380 million?
That's what I said.
And that's really striking, because I think that one of the quandaries we've had in enforcing the rules we have on short-term rentals is that enforcement takes bodies to go out and do inspections, and it costs money. But if you're talking about that kind of return in terms of affordable housing, then spending a significant amount of enforcement might be well worth it.
I think enforcement will more than pay for itself. We're happy to come forward to the council with more specific data in this regard. But we're receiving cooperation in part from the short-term rental platforms and from Portland State University in this regard.
You know, in fairness, cooperation from the short-term rental platforms, if they took a page out of the way Uber and Lyft participate in the city, would be very simple. They would simply agree that no one would be able to advertise a unit on their platforms unless they had independently verified they were in compliance with city law. To the credit of Uber and Lyft, and I've had my issues with both, they don't allow their drivers on the platform unless it's been established that they have a license. That's the one difference, and it seems to me, and there's a chasm between those two industries. And if we could get the short-term rental industry to behave as responsibly in this area as Lyft and Uber, then at least we would be able to say to the guests that we are reasonably confident that you're moving in, that you are occupying a safe unit. Without it, they're making money at the top and shifting the risk to the customer. And that to me is irresponsible.
Well, another profound thing that I don't want to dwell upon because this isn't a fair housing hearing, but there's quite a lot of national evidence that the exchange between a host and a guest is racially biased because the profile of the guest is visible to the host. And in blind treatments, using names that are customarily associated with people of color, there has been a marked increase in the amount of racial discrimination. We're especially cognizant of that, and we're looking for means by which disparate impact can be demonstrated, either through racial or for people with disabilities. So we're mindful and continue to monitor that.
Thank you.
This concludes my remarks.
Thank you. Any further questions from council? Okay.
I'd like to follow up to see if you have an answer to my question about the shelters.
Well, I don't. I was reading the ordinance, and I know the city attorney was directly involved with drafting of this ordinance. I know that each of the commissioners' offices were directly involved. I think it's covered in the detail, and by raising this, and perhaps by the end of the meeting, we'll have a response.
My understanding is it is covered. Kurt, could you and the city attorney get together and reassure us of that?
Well, specifically under 150440, the declaration of state of emergency, it says that a housing emergency is a health and safety emergency under Portland City Code in 33. Mass shelters are allowed as temporary activities for the duration of the emergency subject to the standards in 33-296040. And I brought that up during the discussion about Terminal 1 because in some ways it's unfortunate that it says that we're not waiving those standards and those don't allow any kind of permanent improvements, which seems like a complete waste of taxpayers' money to have a shelter operating for a year using porta potties when you can probably do it much as cheaply and offer a shower and bathroom facilities. So that's something that the city attorney could get back to me before the end of the hearing. Because, we want to have a holistic solution and we don't want to not waste any money anywhere. So either we say that we have to figure out the whole part about what's allowed under a housing emergency and what improvements are allowed under temporary activities.
I'll cite the Terminal 1. Under the current law, and it has not been challenged in LUBA, so we'll have to wait for that legal process. But in light of the R2D2 decision, and in light of what we know about our code, there potentially can be a temporary shelter there as long as there are no improvements made to the warehouse. If there are improvements made to the warehouse, then that violates our code. And that's because the use is, by definition, a temporary use that is sanctioned under the emergency where we're waiving some things. But once it becomes more permanent, then you run afoul of what Luba said. That made the R2, from their point of view, made the R2D2 move to Central East Side illegal. So that's the line. And I mean, I have many reasons why I think T1 is a bad idea. But in the short term, there can be no changes, substantial changes to the site. Otherwise, it runs afoul of our code.
And Mayor Hales, are you still with us?
I sure am.
Right. The ordinance doesn't need to be renewed until October. That the housing state of emergency doesn't need to be renewed until October. Is that correct?
That's right. But obviously, we wanted to have time for it to go into effect with the usual 30-day ordinance period.
Oh, right. Well, perhaps what we should do today is hear the testimony from everybody and see if we do have complete consensus on the council so that we could perhaps take another week to be thinking about doing it as or even longer than a week, do it as an emergency, but having all kinds of discussion, particularly as Commissioner Fish said, in light of the Right to Dream 2 decision from the Land Use Board of Appeals yesterday, that I think does have significant implications for shelters everywhere and for, again, wise use of taxpayers' money.
Can I make a suggestion? We're not going to take we have a substantive ordinance that says we're extending the clock without making substantive changes. My strong recommendation is...
Right, the question was whether, Commissioner Chris, I think, has raised a good point, and that is, given those new developments, if there's a likelihood or an understanding on the council that we're going to unanimously support an extension of the emergency declaration, then that can be done as an emergency ordinance rather than as a conventional ordinance and not have the 30-day period. So I'm certainly open to that scenario if that's where, after this hearing, the consensus of the council lies.
Yeah, and once if the council does agree to extend by the year, which I think there's broad agreement, it seems to me if there's other tweaks to the code that anyone wants to consider, we can bring that back as a separate package.
Correct.
Okay, thank you both. And our final invited guests are George Devendorf, Executive Director of Transition Projects, Inc., Shannon Singleton, Executive Director of Join, Ibrahim Mubarak, Right to Dream 2, and Israel Baer, Street Roots. I don't know if we have enough chairs for all four of you. It'd be nice if we had a fourth chair. Okay, great. Okay, I'll start with you, George.
Great. Thanks very much and good afternoon. The message I'm hoping to offer you this afternoon with regards to...
Oh, give us your name.
Sorry, George Devendorf, Executive Director of Transition Projects. So my message with regards to the state of emergency, I believe, is relatively straightforward, and that is stay the course. The state of emergency over the past year And I would say the momentum that it's generated have achieved quite a bit. But those achievements need to be sustained because, as we all know, has been said by everyone here today, our homelessness crisis remains with us. So with that in mind, I wanted to offer a couple of insights and perhaps make a recommendation or two as you deliberate this issue. And I wanted to focus my remarks particularly on shelter, which has come up a few times. My colleagues here and throughout this hearing will quite rightly emphasize the long-term overriding importance of housing, affordable housing in this issue. And I wholeheartedly concur with them, but wanted to mention a couple of things about our efforts which have drawn quite a bit of attention, specifically around shelter. So the first is that the demand for shelter remains extremely strong. During the past year, Transition Projects succeeded in helping over 800 individuals formerly homeless to regain their housing. And that represents an all-time high in our agency's almost 50-year history. Unfortunately, we've also been experiencing all-time highs in some other categories, including the number of people that we're helping each day in our day center in Clark Commons, and also the number of people on our waiting list to access our long-term shelter. And so those wait times, which were referenced earlier, amount to 6 months for men or women trying to access our long-term shelter, not housing, but shelter. And tellingly, those wait times have not gone down during the state of emergency, even as our community has made great strides in adding additional shelter space. And I think that's an important indicator for the demand that's out there. We also know that folks outside, many of them, want to come inside. And we know that in part from the survey work we do in our day center, where, among other things, 87% of those in the day center who are sleeping outside have signaled to us that they would avail themselves of shelter if it were available to them. But we also know it from the past month, where our mobile engagement team has been very active in the Springwater Corridor and has already helped 20 individuals living in the corridor to find space in the Hanson shelter, temporary emergency shelter, and have identified 30 others who would like to access space there once that space becomes available, something that will hopefully happen during the month of September. Second point relates to the accessibility of shelter. So during the state of emergency, this community has more so than in the past embraced a low barrier, come as you are approach to offering shelter to those who need it most. And that embrace has really enabled us to offer people living on the streets three of the most important things that a shelter can offer, and that is the 3 Ps, right? So their partners, their pets, and their possessions. And to the extent that we can offer that, we literally open the door to scores of individuals living outside who previously have found the idea of coming inside to be untenable because of oftentimes those 3 Ps. So this has been an important, I think, shift or reprioritization in the way that we're offering safe places for people to sleep. My third point relates to flow-through, and that's something we often talk about. We all know that shelter is only valuable insofar as it plays a meaningful role in helping someone to regain housing. Flow-through, in this case, referring to our ability as a community to ensure that those who are going through shelter have a reasonable chance and all the assistance we can offer to help them achieve that housing goal. During the past year, during the state of emergency, we noticed in my agency alone that we were able, our ability to place guests in our long-term shelters into permanent housing increased substantially. So 2 years ago, about 27% of guests coming out of our long-term shelter went into permanent housing. Last fiscal year, that number went up to 41%. So that's a 14% increase in placement rate just over 1 year. And that kind of success in flow-through is directly attributable to the decisions taken by local and federal leaders to prioritize housing assistance funding. I can't overstate how important that is as we look at providing quick, temporary, and immediate forms of support to people living on the street. If we're going to, I think, continue to move that needle forward in the coming years, we're going to need, in this housing market, to make very strong, continue to make strong investments in housing and in the development of not only rental assistance, but affordable housing. Finally, I think the way forward, the one comment I'd make is that The state of emergency has brought a sprinter's sense of urgency to the way this community has been addressing homelessness, and I think that's been a really good thing. It's helped to galvanize attention, it's spurred very timely, and I'd say well-coordinated work on the part of governmental actors, and it's increased public support and volunteerism for our efforts. But the reality is we're not really just looking at a single sprint, we're looking at a series of sprints that will have to be sustained in the coming years and supported and really championed by this city council and the city councils that will follow it. So in the coming years, I would simply recommend that we continue to focus our attention and dedicate significant resource in 3 smart investment areas: shelter, rental assistance, and deeply affordable housing. Deeply because although our community has made strides in directing more resourcing towards affordable housing, we know that if we want to have a positive impact on the most vulnerable in our community, we need to be prioritizing housing that is affordable to those on the street looking to end their homelessness and regain their housing. Thanks very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Ms. Shannon, why don't you go ahead and just give us your name, affiliation?
I'm Shannon Singleton. I'm the Executive Director of Join. And I'm just here to give a little bit of information about Join and what we're seeing on the streets. A lot of folks know that Join works with people who are sleeping in cars and on the streets in our community and helps them move back into housing. But we're also supporting a number of households who we've worked with in the past to help them try and maintain their housing. Right now, I would say that Join is not a lack of people to serve, but we're at a terrible lack of affordable units for people to move into. In addition to that, we're seeing whole building evictions. We're seeing rent increases that are completely unaffordable for the people who may have been stable in their housing for 5, 6, 7 years. With the extension of this state of emergency, the council will affirm that not only what is a personal crisis for many individuals in Portland, but is also a crisis for our city as a whole. The rate of rent increases, the request for double and sometimes triple deposit for apartments, requiring income that is 3 times the monthly rent in order to rent a unit, in addition to other screening barriers, is not only preventing people from moving inside, but also pushing people into homelessness. I hope the council commits to not only continuing the work to expand safety off the street options, but also addresses the affordable housing need as well as the tenant protection issues that have been far too long ignored. I implore you to use this ordinance as a mechanism to address this housing crisis and continue the work that has started in this past year. And I'm going to end instead of repeating everything that you've already heard from everyone who spoke before me.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rivard? Here we go. Give us your name.
Different Rivard. I'm CEO of Right to Survive and Chairman of Right to Dream 2. What we deal with is people that are torn and broken and tired. And you want to bring the state of emergency, which you had once, and the other grassroots organizations like Hazelnut Grove, Lost Rail, Dignity Village, and Right to Dream 2 went out telling the people who was living on the streets in the Springwater Quarter, in bushes and vacant houses, cars, and RVs that it's okay to sleep on the street for a certain amount of time. And then the police came and arrested and swept people. So I really don't trust this unless it's written. You say it on the news and everybody know, and tell the police to stop sweeping the people if this is going to go. And it should go for more than a year. It should go until we have a solution, not an in the meantime solution for people to get inside. You're putting all this money into all these organizations, all these NFs and busts. You need to make affordable housing, subsidized housing. You need to stop the rent raise, put a rent freeze on where people who work and live on the streets can afford apartments. If you bring more affordability, I believe you'll put a 30% cut in houselessness on the street. If you bring more subsidized housing instead of high condos, you'll put at least 40% in a rate. You make family institutions for families to go into places, for people with pets to go into places. You'll cut by 50% of people living on the street. You want an emergency housing and houseless act, then why are you sweeping the Springwater Quarter? Where are those people going to go? Why did Aluba stop Righteous Dream 2 from moving to a spot where we could provide more places for houseless people? Why are you trying to move Hazelnut Grove and Forgotten Ram? You need to make more RV camps for people living there and make spaces for people living in their cars. I know you tried to do that before, but the neighborhood association, they got to realize that we are their neighbors. We should be involved in the neighborhood association. If you're going to make plans for people that's affected, you need people with more the grassroots community in these plans, making things, because we know what it is that can make us successful. You need to start recycling knowledge and not just bottles and bricks and wood and cardboard. You need to recycle knowledge, because the houseless community do know things, and they do know things how to get invented to make them more productive. So this act that you're trying to pass, this emergency thing, it'll only work if we can sit at the table and help you tweak the messages and the things that need to be done in there, and you need to reach the police and tell them to stop sweeping people and stop the landlord for raising the price of rent.